local man busted for child pornography. The story at 11.
This is an ABC News special report. President Bush's address to Congress. Now reporting from ABC News World Headquarters in New York, Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. This is a very important national occasion, the most important speech the President has given to the American people. What does he intend to do now in the fight against terrorism? How does the President plan to make the United States a safer place? What greater role will the federal government now have in people's lives? Congress is gathered. This is already being referred to in the White House as the Bush Doctrine. The President, who will arrive momentarily, has sat down with his staff and considered this message to the world very carefully. He will talk tonight in detail about American principles, who the enemy is, and who it is not. In this and every other nation, what he says and how he says it will have a huge impact. Thank you for joining us. There is enormous anticipation in the Congress tonight. There has just been a great round of applause for the Mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, and the Governor of New York, who have arrived to join the President as his special guest with Mrs. Bush. And I want to just ask very quickly, Linda Douglas, how tight is security?
It is very tight, Peter. There have been helicopters circling overhead, military jets flying overhead. The Capitol's been essentially locked down for several hours, where it's really difficult to move through the Capitol at all, or if you do, with a police escort. Okay, thanks very much, Linda. As Linda says, the tightest security ever, and in fact, Speaker of the House agreed that the majority leader of the Republicans in the Congress stay away, and the Vice President is not there this evening as well. Mrs. Bush, Governor Pataki, and right beside her, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, who's been to see the President today and is here tonight not only as a representative of Britain, but as a guest of the Bush family. Terry Moran, well, I'll ask you in a moment to join us, because I think Bill Livingood, the House Sergeant-at-Arms, is about to introduce the President.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Terry Moran, our White House correspondent. I assume that everybody at the White House realizes what an enormous occasion this is.
Absolutely, Peter. One top aide said it is an educational responsibility, and by that he meant that the President is going to try to answer questions that Americans have about what went on and identify who is responsible for these attacks in a way that might assuage fears, fix the target. He's also going to make some very strong demands on the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, demands that they probably will not meet.
The President comes to the Congress tonight with an overwhelming reservoir of goodwill from the country and everybody who has worked on Capitol Hill. If you notice, Tom Daschle, the Democratic leader in the Senate, right there behind him, everybody has remarked time and again, Senator Schumer of New York, just how different the environment is on Capitol Hill than it has been for many, many years. The President saying good evening to members of the Supreme Court on his way by. Outgoing Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, other members of the Joint Chiefs. The American political and judicial establishment is all here. We've heard the President many times this week, often very spontaneously. This is the time to hear him after he has sat down and considered the entire notion of what, as I said, the White House is referring to as a Bush Doctrine. Senator Byrd of Virginia, the Democrat, and the Chairman of the House, Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert.
Congress, I have the high privilege, the distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
This in itself a demonstration to the world that in times of adversity, the political establishment is one.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President pro tempore, members of Congress, and fellow Americans. In all that lies before us, may God grant us wisdom, and may He watch over the United States of America. Thank you.
President of the United States warning the Taliban in Afghanistan that if they do not give up Osama bin Laden and all those who work with him, they will suffer the same fate. Telling the rest of the world that you either are with the United States and its allies, then you will be against the United States. Telling other nations that any one of them that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as hostile. Telling the United States military that the hour is coming when the United States will act and that they will make the country proud. As he speaks to the members of the Supreme Court, asking the country to uphold the values of America and remember why so many have come here. As he speaks to other important congressmen and senators on important committees dealing with this, he asks their continued participation and confidence in the American economy. And in naming tonight Tom Ridge, the governor of Pennsylvania, to head the Office of Homeland Security, reporting directly to the President, saying to the citizens of the United States that he will do whatever it takes to protect their safety. And saying that he and his administration, the country, and all law enforcement agencies in the country will come together to give law enforcement the additional tools it needs to track down terror at home. Whether the President said we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done. I have several of my colleagues with me this evening and would like to hear their impressions of the speech, and I'm going to start with George Stephanopoulos.
Peter, the President asked the country to be calm and resolute, and tonight he led by example. He was resolved, he was reassuring, he was sober, he was strong, and to me, he's never seemed so convinced before, never seemed so convinced of his cause, or so convincing and deliberate. He described a war that will be long and difficult and different, but he also described a war that can be won, and I thought one of the interesting sentences in the speech was, he said this war will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. That is an objective he can meet because, of course, of the qualification of global reach. He defined the enemy, he defined the goal.
The President comfortable with himself and with the country. In Washington, Cokie Roberts.
Peter, this is what we're seeing right now, the president walking out and shaking these hands. He came down, put his arm around Tom Daschle, the Senate Majority Leader, then made a point of walking down an aisle through the seats to greet Kwesi Nkrumah, a former member of Congress, now the head of the NAACP. This is a moment of unity that he has not had in his presidency, and the coming to the Congress created this for him. They've been talking it, but now we as Americans see it. And seeing this dome, Peter, that moment when we thought we could have lost the dome of the Capitol in this terrorist attack, it really got to members of Congress. When they came back from their bunker that Tuesday, they looked up and said, thank God it's still here. And the fact that it might not have been, you think about it, Lincoln kept the dome being built through the Civil War, Roosevelt kept it lit up through the World War II. The importance of coming to the Capitol, coming to the Congress cannot be overstated.
Right beside Cokie Roberts tonight in our Washington Bureau, ABC's Sam Donaldson. Sam?
Peter, this was a fierce speech. It sounded fierce. The president looked fierce. I mean, if you look back at the old film of Franklin Roosevelt asking that Congress for declaration of war, you do not see the same type of fierce presentation. I mean, you look at it, Peter, and you think of Shakespeare, cry havoc, let's slip the dogs of war. Well, I think that's probably what the country wanted to hear. The mood of this country is very angry. The president could not have gone forward and seemed to be mild in his presentation. On the other hand, I suppose there are those who worry that now this administration, this country, all of us have to deliver, have to come forward, and in fact, Osama bin Laden must be brought to justice, hard to find as he may be in Afghanistan, assuming that's where he is. Other terrorist groups must be rooted out, perhaps even harder to find them. A war the president said would last for years must be fought. And when he turned to the military and said, be ready, you will make us proud. It's going to be the kind of declaration, the kind of fierceness that has to be followed through. If there isn't a follow through, it's going to be a terrible, terrible letdown.
Thank you very much, Sam. Before we actually leave the Congress itself, I want to hear from ABC's Linda Douglas, who covers the Congress on a daily basis for us. The relationship between the President and the Congress has been transformed in many ways.
Oh, it really has, Peter. The reason that you're not seeing me now, by the way, is because they've asked us to turn all of our lights off for the president's departure. I cannot emphasize to you how tight the security is. This relationship has fundamentally transformed because they were so partisan to begin with, but it's really more than that, Peter. This is very real. I talked to the Majority Leader Tom Daschle the other day, who told me that he's speaking to the president now on a daily basis, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes at a time. The president is asking his advice, and what you saw in the hug that took place between the president and the Majority Leader Tom Daschle was real affection.
We're not just all journalists here this evening. We have several guests who have listened very carefully to this for the message that it sends, not just beyond the country, but beyond, not just beyond Washington, but beyond the country. We're joined in Washington by the chaplain, the Muslim chaplain at Georgetown University, Imam Yahya Hendi, who's in our Washington Bureau this evening. Imam Hendi, the president spoke very explicitly and directly, not only to the nation's Muslims, but to the world's.
Yes.
And how effective do you think he was in this particular regard?
Well, I think he did very well in terms of, number one, making that there's a distinction between Islam and terrorism, that Islam is a religion of peace, a religion of justice, and he also urged the American people to be cautious, not to jump into conclusions and to go after Muslims or Arabs in America. But I believe he needed to be more aggressive or more assertive in that message. There are international students in America who decided to leave America in the last few days because of the tragedy, out of fear. I needed to hear him more clear in terms of his message to the American people, because there are 240 cases so far of Muslims being attacked, being discriminated against. I needed more a clear message to the American people from him, I guess.
Thank you, Imam Hendi, very much.
Thank you.
We're also joined by the president of one of the nation's foremost universities, Brown University in Rhode Island. Ruth Simmons is the first Afro-American president. of a major Ivy League university and therefore sees this, I think, from a variety of perspectives. President Simmons?
Well, Peter, I'm so touched by the president's speech. I think it was a stirring, moving performance, and he touched all bases. He rallied the country. He talked about compassion. He talked about respect for different religions. He talked about the need for Americans to be strong and to face the future. So it was an incredible performance, and I think that most Americans can feel very proud of the Congress and the leaders of the country tonight.
Sam Donaldson referred to this, I think, as an aggressive speech, or certainly a very forward-leaning speech. You talk to university presidents all over the country. You know the American college student body well. How will it go down on the campus?
I think it will be mixed, of course, because young people are going to naturally be concerned about the future that they're going to face. That is to say, what kind of war are we looking at if, in fact, we are going to see combat? What will it mean for them? They're very much concerned about the kind of future that they will inherit. So I think that they're going to want to analyze the president's words very closely. They will pay attention to intent here. They'll pay attention to whether or not the words that he spoke encompass all areas of the world and compassion to all groups, because young people care deeply about this. But at the same time, many of them want to see the country rally around our armed forces and support the inevitable conflict that will arise. And so I think that it will be very mixed on our campuses.
Many thanks, President Simmons.
Thank you.
The President spoke very specifically about the economy and about airline safety and the condition of the nation's airlines. We're joined by our business correspondent, our business and economic correspondent, Betsy Stark, tonight. Betsy, you talked to the business community. You've heard the debate about how much government should get involved in trying to give the economy a boost. How do you think it will be received in the business community?
Well, Peter, I think there are certain industries in this country that are in such deep financial trouble, the airlines, as you suggested, travel and tourism, that they want to know what Washington is going to do for them right now so that they can stay in business, so they can avoid more layoffs. Those kinds of specifics were not given tonight. They were not expected. Beyond that, I think the business community was looking for enough show of leadership from the president, enough of a sense of a specific plan of action that it will begin to restore consumer confidence in the future. And consumer confidence is absolutely key to the economy. We heard the president ask Americans to show their confidence by continuing to participate in it.
And Lisa Stark, who covers the aviation industry for us and the Federal Aviation Administration. The president spoke, among other things, of the Marshals Program. In the last week, how much progress has the nation's aviation network made in making it safer?
Well, they've certainly started to add many more air marshals. About 50 will be ready to roll this weekend. They anticipate they'll be training at least 100 more every few days starting next week. But there's a lot more to be done, and both the Transportation Secretary and the head of the Federal Aviation Administration acknowledged that today on Capitol Hill under very sharp questioning by lawmakers. They acknowledged there is much more to be done, and they promised that they would do it. Peter?
Thanks very much, Lisa. While we're in Washington, I want to talk to ABC's Claire Shipman, who covers the White House for us. Claire, the president said at one point, from this day forward, any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. Should we be taking that as the Bush doctrine?
I think so, Peter, and it's interesting because this was a very firm message to the international community, and it's not necessarily the message those abroad wanted to hear. Moderate Arab nations, even NATO allies, were not looking for a lot of bellicose language about war. They weren't looking for ultimatums, but that's what they got, and that's what they've been hearing in private. In fact, the only thing that I think some of the nations abroad, especially the moderate Arab nations, were looking to hear was the fact that this is not a war against Islam, it's not a war against Arabs. They got that part of the message, but for the most part, this is not going to be reassuring to the international community, which was looking for something probably a little bit softer.
Thank you, Claire, very much. Now let us turn to Afghanistan, to which, or to whom, in the persons of the Taliban who run Afghanistan, the president was so direct. Delivered to the United States authorities all the leaders of Osama bin Laden's organization. Close immediately every terrorist base. Give the United States full access to terrorist training camps so the U.S. can make sure. These demands are not open to negotiation or discussion. The Taliban must act, and act immediately. They will hand over the terrorists or they will share their fate. We're joined this evening by the retired General Richard Hawley from Newport News, Virginia. Your reaction to that, sir?
Well, Peter, the president set some pretty strong objectives. He defined the adversary. So I think the military and the armed forces got what they needed tonight from this speech. But more important, I think they got a demonstration of strong and united leadership from both the president and a united Congress, leading a united American people, which is really the most important thing that the armed forces need right now at the beginning of what is going to be a very difficult and long campaign that's going to involve more than just the armed forces. There's an awful lot of other agencies and people around the world who are going to be in this with us.
I appreciate it, General Hawley. Thank you very much. I want to turn to our resident military analyst, Tony Cordesman, for, if I may, a brief answer, Tony, on how tall an order is this in Afghanistan.
It is a tall order, Peter, because it's bin Laden, his entire network, and within hours or days, it's the Taliban regime.
That was certainly brief, Tony. Thank you very much. I'd like to get at least a minute or less, if I may, from our correspondent in Pakistan tonight, Bob Woodruff, as to how this will be received in that part of the world.
Well, Peter, the people here were holding out some hope, at least, that maybe war was not coming to this area. The president tonight really foreclosed that completely. This is an ultimatum to the Taliban that cannot possibly be met reasonably. This is a regime that could barely get it together to just urge Osama bin Laden to leave, and now they're asking him to hand him over and also give the U.S. access to their camps. They will never do that. Of course, students of history will remember that World War I began with an ultimatum to the Serbs that could never be met.